Hello. In today's lecture, I will give you a short introduction to psycholinguistics, and we'll talk in a little bit more detail about speech production. What is psycholinguistics? As the name suggests, it's the field of study that lies on the intersection of linguistics and psychology. We ask questions such as how do we store and process language? Psycholinguistics is interested in all of the different mental structures and processes involved in, for example, speech production, what happens in the mind to make it possible for us to produce language, lexical processing, that is the recognition of words, what happens in our minds that allows us to recognize words and name things. Also, psycholinguistics studies speech perception. How are we able to decode the raw physical acoustic signal into individual sounds? Although we will not discuss speech perception in detail in this course. As well as sentence processing. How are we able to process the syntax of language, which we also won't go into in this course. And finally, psycholinguistics also asks how language gets into the mind. So language acquisition, language learning, interaction of languages in bilingual and multilingual speakers, as well as language disorders. What happens when language is disordered? And these two topics, language acquisition and language disorders, we will cover in later lectures. Let's think about perception versus production of language. On the one hand, in the process of speech production, we start with the idea that we want to communicate. For example, a dog, here represented by a picture of a dog. So we start with this abstract concept of a dog, and we need to encode it or translate it into the word dog that we then produce. In speech perception, it is the opposite process. We hear the word dog, and we are supposed to decode it and evoke the idea or the abstract concept of a dog. So in these two opposite processes, there is a difference in what is the stimulus or the thing that acts upon us. In speech production, the stimulus is our idea of a dog. In speech perception, the stimulus is the sound of the word dog. And the response is different. So our behavior, our reaction to the stimulus. In speech production, the response is the production of the word dog, the articulation of the word dog. Whereas in speech perception or comprehension, our response is evoking of the idea of a dog. So naturally, both of these processes will require different steps, and we'll start by talking about language production. To imagine all of the steps necessary for language production, we're going to use Levelt's model. This model of speech production is very popular. There are other models that differ in the details, but the general steps that are required are similar. So, first of all, we need conceptualization. We need to come up with the idea that we want to communicate. For example, the idea of a dog barking in the past. This is our message. This is our concept. Then we need formulation. This is where we find the syntactic frame that we want to use and where we find the lexical items that we want to use. So we find the syntactic frame, NP, VP, and then we choose the lexical items, dog and bark. We also do phonological encoding. That is, we find the phonological form of the words that we have selected. And finally, we have articulation. That is the actual physical pronunciation of the sentence, the dog barked. So these steps seem intuitively correct, but how do we know this is what actually happens in the mind and it's not just our idea or our description of it? One important source of information about what actually happens in the mind are slips of the tongue. Slips of the tongue are accidental production, or in other words, performance errors. They are not related to a lack of knowledge, but rather they're a result of accidental misspeaking. They happen when incorrect items are selected or if the correct items are mixed up and show up in a wrong order on the lexical, syntactic, or phonological level. They are interesting to psycholinguists because they reveal the process of production by exposing how things go wrong and where things go wrong. In other words, when the mechanism is working fine, it is harder to see the different parts that are responsible for how it works. But when things break down, that's when we can observe the levels of structure underneath. And indeed, we observe slips of the tongue on different levels of linguistic structure. Slips can affect consonants, such as saying breath of fresh air instead of breath of fresh air. Vowels, such as if we say full the pill instead of fill the pool. Syllables, when we say unanimity instead of unanimity. Morphemes, such as saying easy enoughly instead of easily enough. Or entire syntactic phrases, such as in this example, my brother went to the mosque, when the erroneous production would be, the mosque went to my brother. And since we see these types of errors in speech of people, we can say that this is evidence that these elements of structure actually exist, right? Since errors can be made involving these different elements, that means they actually exist in the mind. In other words, they are psychologically real. The fact that we can swap my brother with the mosque means that they are treated on some level in the mind as chunks. And this, of course, corresponds to the idea of syntactic phrases. Similarly, vowels are often replaced with vowels and consonants with consonants. That's how we know that they are actually classified into a single group, consonants together and vowels together in the mind. So these units are not just descriptions of linguists, they have psychological validity. Slips can also result in selecting the wrong word, where there is nothing in the rest of the sentence that explains the error. In these cases, we can learn something about the organization of the mental lexicon. What we often see in these types of errors is that the wrong words are usually related to the words that were intended. For example, you might say, my thesis is too short when you mean my thesis is too long. So long and short are both semantically related. Or you might say optical conclusion instead of optical illusion, where the two words illusion and conclusion are not at all related semantically, but are very similar phonologically. Because we see these types of errors, we know that the mental lexicon is organized both semantically and phonologically, and different related items are activated by the stimulus and compete for selection. To imagine this, look at this illustration. We think that all of the words are linked together according to semantic and phonological similarity, so that when you see the cat, for example, the item cat is activated in your mind. But this item also sends activation to all the words that are semantically related, for example, lion, animal, dog, and also all the words that are phonologically related, such as hat, cut, or car. This can explain why we can mix these words up sometimes and refer to our dog instead of our cat, or pronounce cat as cut. This also has consequences for word recognition that we will talk about in the next video.